Welcome to the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. My name is Jeanette Cochran. I'm a pastor, women's leadership coach, and self-proclaimed Jesus feminist. I'm on a mission to inspire and equip women everywhere to own our voice, speak up, create, and lead wherever God calls. Because when women rise, everyone wins. Hello there, friends. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for tuning in. I am so excited to be with you today. I have a topic that I want to talk about that I am passionate about, and ironically, it is emotions. Ironically, I am feeling all the feels about this topic of emotions and leadership and women, and are we too emotional, and all the things. So before I dive into today's topic, I just want to say thanks so much again for being a part of this podcast. I started this many years ago with a desire really to encourage and equip women in their leadership spaces, or even and that may be in the workplace, that may be in a ministry, that may be in their home, to really encourage women with biblical teaching and leadership development and research-backed information about their strengths and their gifts and why their voice is needed so that they can move in the spaces where they live and lead to bring about the change that we need so that men and women can lead together in relationships where they really are mutually sharing their gifts and sharing leadership, and all voices are heard and valued. And so if you're here, I just thank you for being here. I hope you're gaining something from it. I would ask you, if you find anything that's beneficial, would you share it with another woman that you think might benefit? Because we have a lot of change to make in our world, and women have so much to offer. And too many of us have been told that there are spaces where our voices and our leadership are not welcomed, or they're off limits, or even that God doesn't want us to be in those spaces. And I just know that that is not true. And the world needs men and women working and leading together in relationships of honor and mutuality. So that's just a little reminder about what this podcast is all about, and the important work that you are doing wherever you are. So let's dive in. I want to start by asking you a question. What would happen if you walked into work tomorrow and left every emotion at the door? No excitement, no frustration, no empathy, no passion, just cold, detached logic. Would that make you a better leader? Would it make you a better team player? Or would it strip away what actually makes you human? Women have often been told that we are too emotional. Some of us have been told that the reason women are not suited or created for leadership is because we are too emotional. But today we are flipping the narrative, and I am exposing the truth. Emotion isn't a weakness. It's actually a powerful leadership asset, and it's time that we start owning it. How often have you heard someone insinuate, or maybe say directly, that women are too emotional? It's one of the long-standing stereotypes that still persists today. This stereotype is reinforced by patriarchy and complementarian teachings. One of the foundational arguments in John Piper's complementarian teaching, he's a theologian who repeatedly emphasizes that Eve was deceived because she was more emotionally vulnerable to the serpent's lies. So he teaches that the reason Satan in the Genesis narrative approached Eve in the fall was because he knew that she was going to be emotionally vulnerable, and that Adam would not have fallen, so to speak, for the emotional trap. And then he teaches that Adam's sin was that he passively stood by and didn't step up and exercise leadership. And so this is why in Piper's view, or this is one reason I should say in Piper's view, that women should not exercise authority over men, particularly in teaching roles, because he believes that Scripture teaches that women are emotional and therefore we are more easily deceived than men. This stereotype also shows up in teachings about marriage. The wildly popular book called Love and Respect by Emerson Eggerichs, he suggests that women's emotional needs often lead them to behave irrationally, and that it is the reason that they need a man's stability and a man's logic. In his view of marriage, the husband is the leader in the family, and he is always better suited to make the important decisions because he is by nature more logical. In my view, there are a lot of problems with this kind of thinking, but let's just first look at what the Bible actually shows us. Is this teaching responsible and accurate according to what we see in the Bible? Are women driven by emotions and therefore more vulnerable to deception, and that it inhibits our ability to make decisions and lead effectively? I would argue that this is unsupported by Scripture, research, and unfounded when we explore the reality in the problems of church leadership today. So let me explain. Let me tackle all of those. First, let's look at Scripture. The text in Genesis 3 does not say that Eve was deceived because of emotions. And it doesn't say that Adam was ordained by God to exercise leadership authority over women. That is an interpretive assumption. It is a bias that is brought to the text by a cultural stereotype. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that here today because there's so much to be said on that. But if you want more on this, I encourage you to listen to episode number 2, where I really unpack the Genesis narrative and take a deep dive into the exegesis of the Scripture to say, if we're just going to say, what does the Bible actually teach here in Genesis 3? What can we draw from this? Because oftentimes what we've been told the Scripture says is really someone else's biases or their cultural lens that they have brought to the Scripture. So that's just, look back to episode number 2 if you have not listened to that, and you'll gain a little bit more on what I mean about that Scripture in that particular episode. But I also want to say that Scripture is full of examples of men who let their emotions get the best of them, leading to destructive choices and sin. Right in Genesis, right after the fall, we see Cain's jealous rage drove him to murder his brother. And then in 1 Samuel, King Saul's insecurity and fear led him to disobey God again and again. And then there's David. His unchecked desire resulted in rape and deception. And Peter, in a moment of fear and panic, denied Jesus 3 times. These stories and many more in the Bible make it clear that emotional impulsivity isn't a gendered trait. As human beings, we all have emotions, and we're all capable of letting those emotions lead us in the wrong direction. But the answer isn't to suppress our emotions. It's to develop the emotional intelligence and the spiritual discernment so that our decisions align with God's will. And both women and men are fully capable of doing that. So the stereotype that women are too emotional to lead and that women are more likely to be deceived because of their emotions is not supported by what we see in the lives of both men and women in Scripture. And it also is not supported by research. In fact, recent research shows that it might be backwards, because recent research indicates that men actually are more likely to let unmanaged emotions impact their leadership negatively. Let me explain. A 2024 Harvard Business Review article entitled How Anxiety Shapes Men and Women's Leadership Differently, which I will put in the show notes. I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you want to read the article. It's not that long. This article talks about research that examined 137 leaders during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way this study worked is the leaders reported their emotions during the pandemic, while the employees, which were the direct reports of these leaders, rated their leaders' behaviors. The study found that higher anxiety in leaders was linked to more abusive supervision, while higher hope was linked to more family supportive leadership. However, these effects applied only to the male leaders. So let me explain the key findings. Let me unpack this a little bit deeper. Women leaders showed consistently low levels of abusive supervision, regardless of their reported level of anxiety. But in contrast, the men were more likely to engage in abusive leadership behaviors, things like rudeness, yelling, lying, when they felt anxious. The women leaders also consistently provided family supportive supervision, regardless of whether or not they felt hopeful or optimistic. The men, however, were only family supportive when they felt hopeful. In short, the study suggests that the women leaders maintained steady leadership behaviors, regardless of how they felt, while the men's behaviors fluctuated more based on their emotions. I think this is fascinating. Why? Because I don't know about you, but I've heard that age-old stereotype again and again that women are more impacted by our emotions and that it makes us less fit to lead. This study seems to show just the opposite. Now, why is this? What might be contributing to the very different effects in the way that men and women's emotions differ in their experience and in their actions? The first, I think, the way that we're socialized. From an early age, we as girls are encouraged to be communal, to be empathetic, and to be emotionally aware. We're often taught to prioritize relationships and to consider the emotions of others in our interactions. This actually serves us well, and this makes us better leaders, quite honestly. I mean, the reality is there are areas where this taken too far trips us up. But instead of looking at this like it's always a problem, we need to recognize that this actually serves us also in many ways. As women, we do way more emotional labor. We are socialized to process and manage and regulate our emotions, not just our own, but also of the people around us. I recently had coffee with a friend who shared how she is spending a lot of time helping her pre-teenage daughter navigate difficult friendships at school. And she explained how this is requiring her to just be present and available to her daughter, constantly listening and guiding when she gets home from school, helping her daughter to process these emotions so that she can regain the strength to go back to school and face these social challenges. It's not unusual to hear parents who are raising adolescent girls to talk about the ups and downs of emotions and how much time and attention and energy it takes to help these girls manage their emotions and for us to deal with their emotions. And I want to just suggest, while it does take energy and it is a part of parenting, maybe all of that actually is really good. Maybe all of that is a strength. And that's what's helping us to grow as women, to learn to manage and regulate our emotions and the emotions of others so that when we become leaders, we are better able, to step into situations where maybe we are feeling very anxious. We are very discouraged, but we're still able to step in and manage those emotions and not let it affect the way we show up and the way we interact with others. Because our boys, on the other hand, are socialized very differently around emotions. Boys aren't expected to come with this big array of emotions, and they're not necessarily encouraged to talk about their feelings. And in fact, when they do, oftentimes they're penalized for it. When my daughter was in high school, there was this young man who wanted to ask her to the prom, and he wanted to do it in a really special way. And he knew that she was a huge SpongeBob fan at the time, and so he came up with a creative idea. He took out an ad in the school newspaper with a SpongeBob-themed message asking her to the prom. It was super thoughtful, it was fun, and it was personal. And my daughter, Shannon, she loved it. She saw it for what it was. It was sweet, it was a caring gesture, and it made her feel special. But this particular young man's male peers didn't see it that way. Instead of celebrating his creativity and his thoughtfulness, they mocked him with derogatory names that indicated that he was weak or soft, that he was less of a man. Instead of being admired for his thoughtfulness and his emotional intelligence, he was shamed and penalized for it. Now imagine what that did in the psyche of that young man and what he probably carries around from that today, either consciously or unconsciously. This is a perfect example of how boys are socialized when it comes to emotions. The message that boys often get is showing emotions or prioritizing a relationship makes them lesser in the eyes of other men. And because of it, so many of our boys grow up learning that to maintain social acceptance, they must suppress their emotions, avoid displays of care, and refrain from making themselves vulnerable. And then what happens when these boys grow into men? They struggle to express care. Sometimes they struggle to apologize, or they're not even able to articulate their feelings because they've stuffed them so often that they don't even know what they're feeling. Not because they don't care, but because they've been taught that real men don't show emotions. But here's the truth. Emotions are not a weakness. Emotional connection isn't weakness, it's a strength. And if we want men who are better partners and fathers and leaders, then we have to value the emotional intelligence, not only in women, but also in men. Changing the dialogue about emotions being a girl problem and girls being too emotional, and changing the way that we respond when our boys do show up with care and emotions and vulnerability. The study that I just referenced, How Anxiety Shapes Men and Women's Leaderships Differently, did show that women reported feeling anxious feelings more than the male leaders. But knowing the way that we're socialized, it makes me wonder, do women actually experience more anxiety? Or are men feeling it just as much, but they're suppressing it instead of processing it? Because they've not been encouraged to actually allow those emotions to bubble up and to feel them and to acknowledge them. We don't have to look far to see what happens when church leaders suppress their emotions instead of processing and managing them. Just think of the many high-profile scandals over the last 2 decades. Leaders like Mark Driscoll, Perry Noble, Bill Hybels, Ravi Zacharias. Each case shows unprocessed emotions, unchecked emotions, especially anger and pride, and how that leads to toxic leadership, moral failure, and ultimately the downfall of their ministries. Now, hear me out. I don't share that to judge and shame these men or to create this dichotomy that, men are bad and women are better. But I have to share this because I'm trying to make a point here. We know that the church, especially at the highest levels of pastoral leadership and eldership, is still very male dominant. And one of the narratives that supports that is many people say it's because women are created more emotional by God and therefore they're not as equipped to lead, and that men are more logical and they don't allow their emotions to get in the way. And I share this just to say that's not actually accurate or supported by what we even see happening today in contemporary church leadership. Unmanaged emotions in men or women leads to toxic leadership. So what are the takeaways? Why does this matter? And what can we do about it? We need a new model of leadership in our churches, in our home, in our workplaces. One that values both men and women and integrates emotional and mental health. It's time to stop telling women that we're too emotional, that we need to toughen up or suppress our feelings in order to lead well. Now, of course, there's a time and a place for sharing emotions appropriately. I'm not suggesting unbridled emotions and unmanaged emotions are appropriate. But emotions aren't a weakness in and of themselves. They're an essential part of how God designed us. They give us important information, and ignoring them or suppressing them does more harm than good. We, as human beings, are emotional beings. And so to think that we can suppress or that we can shut the whole emotional context out of our leadership is uninformed and unrealistic. At the same time, we need to destigmatize emotional health for men. Let's encourage our men to acknowledge their emotions and be honest about sharing their struggles, their leadership stress, and their leadership challenges. And when they do, even if it's in the smallest way, let's affirm them for showing strength. Showing emotion is being vulnerable, and it takes leadership strength to show vulnerability. We need to stop seeing emotions as the enemy of leadership. The real issue isn't emotions, but unregulated emotions. The best leaders, whether men or women, practice self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and accountability. And this isn't just good leadership, it's biblical. Jesus modeled emotional intelligence perfectly. He felt deeply, he wept, he got angry, he experienced frustration, but he was never ruled by his emotions. He didn't suppress them or let them drive impulsive or destructive behavior. Instead, he processed his emotions and he aligned them with God's will, and he led with wisdom and love. And whether we are male or female, Jesus is our example. Have you been conditioned to believe that your emotional sensitivity or awareness makes you less effective as a leader? In reality, these qualities make you more attuned, compassionate, and impactful. What if instead of avoiding emotions, we embrace them as a leadership strength? Emotional intelligence is one of the strongest predictors of leadership success, and research shows that women tend to score higher in EQ than men. This makes us naturally skilled at navigating conflict, building relationships, and leading with empathy, all essential traits of great leadership. This week, pay attention to how your emotions show up in leadership. And when they do you see them as a strength or as a weakness? What information are you gaining from those emotions? And how does processing those emotions help you to grow and to lead more effectively? I hope this conversation has been helpful and insightful for you. If so, would you share this episode with another woman who needs to be reminded that her emotional intelligence is a gift and not something to hide? So as we wrap up, my dear sister, I want you to know that your ability to feel deeply, to care intensely, and to empathize with others isn't a weakness. It's your greatest leadership superpower. Emotional intelligence isn't something to suppress. It's the key to stronger, wiser, more impactful leadership. The world doesn't need more emotionally disconnected leaders. It needs bold, emotionally intelligent women who lead with wisdom, resilience, and heart. So own your emotional intelligence. Lead with confidence and rise to your full potential. Because when women rise, everyone wins. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and share it with other women in your network. For more information about me and the work that I do, check out JeanetteCochran.com. And I'd love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social. You can find me on Facebook at J Cochran Coach or Instagram at Jeanette.Cochran.